Okay. Yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone. I've got nearly 100 people on the call tonight, which is fantastic, amazing. So I'd like to introduce you to welcome you to tonight's webinar, which is an introduction to the Green Homes Grant Scheme, the new government scheme, which I know we've had just loads and loads of inquiries about. Loads of people are interested, and lots of the community energy groups, charities, intermediary organisations interested in how they can get involved. And I think also a lot of contractors, big and small, interested in how they can get involved or not. So tonight we're going to go through all that. We're going to talk about the scheme. We're going to explore some of the measures that can be used there. Yeah, we'll go through all sorts of stuff. I'll tee that up in a minute. On the call tonight, so it's not just myself, there's Liam Schofield, who's our People Powered Retrofit Service Manager. You there, Liam?
Hello, yes,
Yeah.
Hello everyone.
Excellent, crystal clear. And we've got Anika Keeley as well, who's our Supply Chain Engagement Officer as well. Hi there, Anika.
Hi everyone.
And so Liam and Anika will be chipping in through the session as well. We've also got a couple of other people in the background, Matt and Lewis, who will be fielding chat and what have you. Just to answer some frequently asked questions, the session will be recorded and will be made available along with all the slides. We put them on our website, so it's publicly available. You can see them on YouTube, you can download, you can share, what have you. We'll also use this session to inform a briefing note that we'll put on our website as well. That'll be a bit more succinct than an hour and a bit webinar. During the webinar, look out for the polls. So we're gonna have a few polls in a sec. Use the chat box to get involved, and as I said, other staff members will get involved there. Apologies, we can't get people discussing, so many people, just be a cacophony. And if you have specific questions, use the Q&A box. And throughout the webinar, Matt and Lewis will be fielding those and maybe resolving those that they can. And we'll go through the presentation. At the end, we'll then have a Q&A bit as well. What I also wanted to just say was, like, this is our view of the scheme at the moment. The scheme may change. There's different aspects around it, training provision, all sorts of things that are changing as well. So as the scheme changes, our views will change on it. So yeah, it's not necessarily, there are still some things to be confirmed as well. So yeah. So about the session, I'll introduce the scheme briefly. And then I will do a little bit, which is a guide to retrofit, really. And I'm really going to keep that brief because I know a lot of people know a lot about retrofit already, but just to kind of ground us, because I know some people are new to this area. I'll talk about the assessment part of the scheme, and then we'll go through primary and secondary measures. And it's at that point that Liam will chip in because he's the expert in this area as well, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of the measures on offer. We'll then talk about finding contractors, and Anika might chip in with some bits about the contractors that we're working with, their perspectives. We'll end with a kind of pros and cons for the scheme, or really things to consider, and then a little bit about how People Powered Retrofit and others that are out there can help householders access the scheme and what have you. What we will not do this evening, and so please don't ask us, is we won't advise you on what measures are suitable in your individual home, because we've never seen your home, so we don't know what it's like. And tonight really isn't about that. Tonight's about the scheme rather than retrofit. We do have lots of training and things going on, and if people are interested, at the end I'll just preview the different bits of training we've got. All sorts of things like a beginner's guide to retrofit, to things that are quite in depth, basically. Okay, we've got a couple of polls, or 4 polls, and what I wanted to do is just get a feel for who's in the room, so to speak, today. So I'm going to launch this poll. So this poll is basically, who are you? What kind of, how would you classify yourself? And you can tick multiple boxes here. So you can work for the government or in the public sector and be a householder. That's allowed. or other things as well. So we'll give you another 10 seconds here. So voting, fantastic. Okay, about 80% of people have voted. So we've got, well, yeah, these add up to more than 100%, but loads of people here classify themselves as householders, so they're interested in the scheme in that context. We've got a few contractors here, a few people from community energy groups as well, and just a very small number of government type people. Everyone's welcome, there's no judgment here. So stop sharing. And let's launch the next poll. So I'm really interested in what people's what kind of knowledge do you have of retrofit at the moment? Are you very much just a beginner here? You're not really sure? Are you kind of a bit in the middle? You know, a little bit, or would you classify yourself as an expert? And it's totally fine to be an expert. You shouldn't be shy about that. I'm sure we do have some experts. Well, we do definitely. Fantastic. People getting quick, which is good. Share the results. Okay, so about half the people classify themselves as kind of intermediary here, a few beginners and a few experts. Okay, that's good, because I think where we've pitched the content will kind of speak to you, which is good. Yeah, stop this sharing. Okay. The third one's about motivations. So again, should be able to multiply vote on this, hopefully. If not, apologies, so it'd be your prime motivation. So yeah, what's your interest in retrofit? Is it about saving money, doing a bit for the environment, modernising or improving your home? Is it about comfort, health and ventilation, obviously in the time of COVID? Or is it about preparing for the impacts of climate change and, you know, strengthening the home? I think I might have done it so you can only do one, I'm afraid. Sorry, I like to do it so multiple ones. Fantastic. Okay. And so the results there, so about 50% of people, their primary concern is around the environment. There's also preparing for climate change impacts, comfort and modernisation, and saving money. Apart from health and ventilation, is the last one on the list, which is really interesting. It's often the result we get when we talk to people, but yeah, it's interesting because the kind of accepted wisdom, should we say, in the sector is that that's not, that people are more interested about money than anything else is secondary. Okay, so the last thing, what are your motivations, your ambitions rather, for retrofit? Are you interested in just doing one or two things, trying to just sort of doing the minimum? Interested in making some significant changes, or interested in doing that whole house, you know, trying to go as far as you can, really? This helps us gives us an idea, really, sort of what your ambition is, where you want to get to. Okay, just a few more seconds. Probably sick of all these polls. Okay, so that's really interesting because most of the people on this call, or maybe nearly half, are interested in going as far as possible, and nearly another half are interested in making some really significant changes, and just 10-15% are interested in just the kind of basic stuff. So that's really interesting as well. So this tells me, I think, that people in the room, mostly householders, have a reasonable level of knowledge of retrofit, are interested in retrofit mostly for environmental reasons, but some other reasons as well, and are quite ambitious in terms of what you want to achieve. So that's good. We shall plough on then. Just a little bit of information. People Powered Retrofit is our service that we run. It's an end-to-end service for householders interested in retrofitting their homes, and we provide services to help them get through those stages of retrofit. It's mostly for people in the Greater Manchester area and a little bit beyond. we're one of 6 pilots being run by Bays to develop new markets for retrofit in localities, and there are some all over the country, so do check those out. But yeah, we're mostly in the northwest. Okay, so I am going to go through. We're going to talk a little bit about the Green Homes Grant Scheme, which has, as you can see here, it's recently released, recently published, just the end of August. Things are still changing. It's money that was given post-COVID, build back better, so to speak, money to improve construction industry in the UK, but we'll focus on the environment and climate change. So a very, very broad outline of the scheme, and then I'll become a bit more detailed. So it's £5,000 per property, which is matched against a householder contribution. If people are in low income brackets or access to benefits, they can gain up to £10,000 of granted money, and that's without any requirement to match. I'll talk a bit more about the match. The grant can be spent on a limited number of specified primary measures, and if the primary measures are accessed, that unlocks some secondary measures. Now, if that sounds a bit bewildering and jargony, I appreciate that. We'll go through each one of the primary measures and explore them in more detail, and then talk in very briefly about secondary measures as well, just to give people an idea of what's possible. There's a limited number of contractors who are able to carry out the work. This can't be done by anyone and everyone. There are some limitations to the contractors. It's a £2 billion scheme, so when the money's gone, it's gone, but divide 2 billion by £5,000 and you'll see there's room for a lot of measures there. It's due to open from the end of September, and I know that people at Bays have been working very hard to get it out of the door. So, maybe there'll be slippage, I don't know, but at the moment they say from the end of September, and the programme will last until the 31st of March 2021. There's no word about follow-on at the moment. We could expect there to be a follow-on, but we can't guarantee that, and we certainly shouldn't plan with that in mind. So in a bit more detail, so the maximum of £5,000 grant will cover 2/3 of the cost of the project of the money you're spending on. This means that there is a 1/3 contribution from the householder, so up to a maximum of £2,500. So if I'm claiming, I'm going to do some maths on the fly there, but if I'm claiming a grant of £3,000, I need to put in an additional amount of money, which I can't calculate in my head. So it kind of scales up there. So however much money I get from the government, I need to match it to the tune of 1/3 to their 2/3. Obviously, as I said, if I'm on a low income, or I'm accessing benefits, and I can receive £10,000 and I don't need to worry about that match. The value of the money I spend on the primary measures, which, as I said, we'll go through, dictates how much I can spend on the secondary measures. For example, if I spend £2,000 on a heat pump, I can spend up to a maximum of £2,000 on any of the secondary measures as well. So that does limit things somewhat, and we'll talk about that as we go on. The application process, it's the householder that applies rather than the contractor. And I would say that if you read the guidance on the government's scheme, you can see that they're still working out that process in some detail. But a lot of it is based around the Simple Energy Advice website, which there's a link that you can go to, or you can just Google it, which basically gives some relatively basic information about retrofit, and it's through that you can apply for your voucher, that you state the measures you want to spend it on, the contractors you want to work with. The idea here is to get at least 3 quotes from people. Let's see how easy that is to do, because the demand is likely to be quite high. And you can start applying from that website from the end of September, so we'll see that. You get the voucher and then you can spend it, and the money comes directly to the contractor rather than to you and then to the contractor. Okay, so that's an outline of the scheme, and I'm sure there'll be questions in greater detail about how the scheme works and all sorts of things like landlords and all that, and we can deal with those in the Q&A as well. What I would say is the website is pretty clear, it's pretty accessible, it's not too much jargon, so that's a good source of information. Okay, I'm really going to briefly talk about an introduction to Retrofit because I think this contextualizes how the scheme fits within that, how you would normally approach Retrofit, let's say. So Retrofit, energy efficiency improvements applied to an existing property. So not a new build, obviously you can build new builds to relatively higher specifications, let's say. So we're talking about tackling the legacy of building stock we have here that will be here for many years to come, and to reduce the energy demand and consequently the carbon emissions. So it's energy improvements that reduce demand, such as insulation, and there's a whole range of things here that you can do in a house, or domestic scale renewables as well. So that's mainly solar panels, let's say, and smart systems as well. And there's a definition of those retrofit improvements within the PAS 2035, which is the new government process standard in this area. There are some principles of how Carbon Co-op and People Powered Retrofit advocate that we should approach retrofit. These are not necessarily universal, but they're best practice, and they're essentially agreed on by most people, including to a greater or lesser degree BEIS as well in government. Fabric first is the first of these. That is treating the fabric of a property to reduce demand first, before moving on to things like the renewables and the heating system, rather than just whacking a load of solar panels on a house and it falling down in 10 or 20 years. It's about improving the fabric, reducing demand through the fabric, through insulation, and then moving on to things. The second thing is whole house. And this is taking a holistic whole house approach to retrofit. As you can see in that diagram, it's many measures applied together. Now, that might be that they're applied all in one go, one big bang. That's one way to tackle whole house, but it might be that it's phased improvements over time. So it's still taking a whole house approach, but it's spreading it out over time to make it more manageable in terms of disruption and also budget as well. And I guess the kind of thing you want to avoid there is doing a whole load of work now, not taking a whole house approach, doing a load of work now, and then later thinking, oh, I've got to take that off because I want to do some other work. And that can relate to things like windows and external wall insulation, all sorts of things. So a whole house approach means you've got a plan, basically. And it sounds like a lot of the people on this call, that's your approach, is whole house as well, which is good. For us as well, we've got wider environmental concerns, and that's around the type of materials being used and their wider sustainability, and also I think worth saying toxicity as well when we think about things like Grenfell and the kind of insulation materials used there, which are highly toxic when burnt, or there are other things as well that might sit in the home for many years. We want to ensure that they're low impact as possible and low toxicity. So that's kind of our approach. It's fabric first, it's whole house, and it's low impact. And there is a process to retrofit, a process reflected in that government standard, PAS 2035, and a process generally adopted by people here within the sector. And it goes from top to bottom here. The arrow goes from top to bottom. So it starts out with advice. There are some job roles here as well. I'm not necessarily going to go into them in great detail, but this helps you orientate the people that work in this sector, basically. So there's general advice and starting out and understanding what's right for you in terms of the retrofit in your house. It's about establishing a project brief. It's then moving on when you know what you want to achieve, to assess the property, understand how you use energy at the moment and how different measures might reduce the amount of energy used and might impact on that in terms of reducing bills and reducing carbon emissions and such. Then when you know what you want to do, it's about design development. And this is where you might involve consultants and architects, so you might involve testing and investigation. So there might be the requirement to do some design work, or it might be about contractors doing design work as they come in and do the work. Then it's about procurement, finding people to do the work, finding contractors. Sometimes one of the biggest barriers in this area, people know what they want to do, but they can't find the people to do it. Then once work's starting on site, it's about coordinating work, it's about ensuring quality and contractor training as well. And finally, when the work is done, it's about handover and evaluation, understanding the impact of the work there. So that's generally the kind of steps that we go through. And I think the real reason I kind of expanded this is because the retrofit project brief is the real cornerstone of any retrofit project. And that's if people are just doing a single measure or just doing this grant scheme and nothing else. These are the things you need to bear in mind when you're starting out, and just to get it clear with yourself or with other people in the property. So it's about your brief, your priorities, whether you're doing other projects at the same time, other renovation and refurbishment, or even extensions and new builds, what your values are, what your philosophy is, what you're trying to achieve, what your motivations are, what your budget is, whether it's fixed, whether you need a financial return because it's an investment and it needs to be repaid, where's the money coming from, and that will definitely impact on this grant scheme. How are you going to procure the work? How are you going to manage time, cost and quality, and the kind of competing things there? Whether you'll do the work in one big job or whether you'll parcel up the work, whether you're going to do it DIY, some aspects or all aspects, or get builders and professionals in, and how you'll cope with disruption. So it's really important, I think, just to set those things out to start with. And one of the key things, I think, to be concerned about in this area, as we talk about the grant as well, is quality. And it is an area where in the past, some schemes, and I don't want to typify because they have, in some cases, been small instances, but some schemes have produced quite poor quality of works. Here is some very poor quality external wall insulation, some examples of the wall insulation on the outside of a building that's been cut out. There are gaps and then core bridges. And just silly little things where care and attention has not been taken to the detailing of the work in terms of the design work up front and in terms of the delivery of the work as well. Maybe there hasn't been supervision on site. Maybe the people doing the work haven't been properly trained. So there is a big warning here that some of these measures that we're talking about, that there are risks involved, and it's around quality and ensuring quality. But just to round off this section, what I would say is there's also a very high impact here. There are fantastic examples out here, especially in Greater Manchester with the Carmen Court membership, with some very high quality retrofit works that have been done. Got lots of case studies, lots of knowledge and expertise. It's achievable, it's possible, it's entirely possible. If we want to reach our kind of ambitions as a country, it's there, we can do it. We just need to set about it in the proper manner. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about assessments and then we'll move on through the measures, and then Liam will get involved at that point. Now, assessment. So when you're going into this scheme, if you're interested, even if you're not even going to do it, it's worth having a go on this. You go to the Simple Energy Advice website and you can do a very simple assessment of your property. And it will come out with a set of measures that you could install on your property. It'll also tell you right from the get-go whether you are eligible for the grant. Yeah, so it's a good thing to do. It's really simple, really, it'll be useful there. What I think we should emphasize here is that it's useful, but it's of limited use. So it's a self-assessment. It's 10 questions and it takes minutes. Yeah, and so we would advise that householders take the information that they're given in the results here with a bit of a pinch of salt, because no one has come to your property, no one has seen your property. The engine behind it, which does this assessment, is the same as the Energy Performance Certificate, EPC engine, or something called RD-SAP, yeah, reduced version of SAP, which is the government's energy modelling tool. And so it needs to be taken in that kind of context. There may be things here that it recommends that are not appropriate for your house. There may be things that it doesn't recommend that are appropriate for your house. And yeah, that needs to be borne in mind. The discussions we've had with BEARS, people say, well, it's about kind of the first point of contact, first point of advice. It's also a portal into the grant scheme as well. But really, don't take this as a way to spend many thousands of pounds on your property. Take some wider advice as well. There are lots of other assessment tools out there and people that can come and do assessments. I would say EPCs are in this bracket of very simplified, and the results are very kind of simplified as a result as well. Carbon Court, we do something called My Home Energy Planner, which we're in the process of rebranding as the Home Retrofit Planner. And there are other organisations out there that do them. They generally, you get what you pay for. Yeah, so we charge starting from £500 for our assessments, but that informs works of many thousands of pounds. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. The more money you're going to spend, the more it's worth investing in assessments. Okay, so that's the kind of proviso. Now we're going to go through the primary measures, and hopefully you're there, Liam.
I'm here and ready.
Cool, yep. Fantastic. So Liam comes from a contractor background, yeah?
Yeah.
And you've got experience of working on sites and all sorts of things, and you're also a prominent member of the Association of Environmentally Conscious Building, the ACB, and I saw there was a few ACB people on the call today as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, well, thank you for that. Yeah. Hello, everyone. So, yeah, we're just going to zip through the basics of definitely a zip through of what constitutes the measures that the government are allowing through.
Yeah.
So we'll go straight in with solid wall insulation.
Yeah. So this relates to both internal wall insulation and external as well, doesn't it, Liam?
Yeah, exactly. So the one, it's pretty obvious. The one on the left is internal. The one on the right is external. There are internal wall insulation is slightly more quite a bit more complicated than external wall insulation. You can have risks to do with condensation and thermal bypass, which means that if air or cold air can get between the existing wall and the new insulation layer, which minimizes the effectiveness of the insulation and can also bring moisture into the property.
Yeah. So it's like a high impact measure, but it's very costly. And like some of the risks that I showed earlier related mostly to external wall insulation. And there are some examples of it done very, very badly, such as in Preston, an area of Preston. So our advice in this area is that often with a risk assessment done, but often, not always, often design input is required and specification to cope with these risks. Would you say, Liam?
Yeah, for sure. It's the design elements of it are really important. It's the little details. You can get 95% of a wall right, but if there's 5% error in there, then that can be where your problems will form. Particularly, as I say, in relation to condensation, that's the major thing to be concerned about when it comes to wall insulation and correctly detailing it.
Yeah. And there's also concern around the materials that are used and the flammability of those materials. This is an area where there's been huge kind of change since Grenfell, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's when you get into the details of the actual materials that you use. We could have a webinar longer than this just based on different materials for internal wall insulation.
Yeah. So
breathability on older houses, breathability is a big factor.
Yeah. A fantastic measure, approach with caution, I think is our thing there. Now, underfloor insulation, that's probably almost goes for this, but double so. A very messy job, impact on comfort, probably about the right price for the grant. Would you say, Liam?
Yeah, it's it's well within what the grant is funding. I do question the fact that on the website that Jonathan was discussing before, it says it's a low impact, low risk measure, which isn't true. It's insulating a timber suspended floor is quite a complicated job. It's not impossible. Many people have done it, but once again, it comes down to the design elements, which we are unclear as to whether the grant will actually pay for any design element to go into it.
Yeah, and a colleague of ours, a friend, Sophie Pelsmaker, has done a whole PhD on retrofitting underfloor suspended timber floors in Victorian houses. And talking, I'm still working on getting Sophie to do a webinar for us. But her summary was kind of like, it's complicated, and that's after doing 3 years of PhD there. Now, cavity wall insulation is in there as well. This is something, so it may be that a property has a cavity in there. So it's a gap between two layers of bricks, really. And that gap can be filled. There are all sorts of different insulants that you can use to fill that. But I think this is a really cautionary one here. There have been some really big examples of it being badly done as well. Would you say, Liam?
Yeah. These there can be big issues here, mainly bridging. If there's anything sort of connecting the internal wall and the external skin of the wall, obviously you've got wall ties, but if those wall ties are covered in mortar snots, that can transmit moisture into the inside of the property. And also you can have bridging at the bottom end of the cavity, again, when mortar's just dropped in as a wall's being built. And it is very complicated and very difficult for a builder when they're building a wall to not drop small amounts of mortar. But that can, again, once you've put the insulation in, can transmit moisture through the property.
And I really do have to mention there's been some big scandals around cavity wall, particularly inappropriate use in areas that are quite exposed. So, I mean, there's been huge issues in Wales, in the coast there, and also exposed areas, upland areas and what have you. Also, I know a study in Northern Ireland carried out where they went back and inspected cavities to see to what extent they had been filled, showed that a very large number of them had not been filled. I think a majority of them. And so there were real concerns there about quality. So it needs proper survey.
Yeah, it's really common if you do a thermographic test on existing cavity wall insulation to see that, let's kindly say that it's settled, but in reality it's just not been filled very well.
Yes.
Very common.
Okay, we're on slightly less risky ground here with lofts and room in the roof. Do you want to talk about this, Liam?
Yeah, well, the main things to look out for when you're insulating a loft space is to make sure that you've got ventilation at the eaves. It's quite common. Many people have done it before, of thinking, well, to get rid of any risk of cold bridging, I'll push the insulation right in at the edges so that it meets the wall. But if you do that, like, the simplest way of thinking about an attic which isn't being turned into a room is you want an absolute howling gale in that attic, like, to keep the ventilation up. It sounds sort of counterintuitive to insulating your house and making it increasingly airtight, but if you've got timber suspended floor and a loft space, you want as much air force through them as you can possibly get.
So relatively simple, cheap, effective, low disruption, good impact. Not huge impact, but a good impact for the money spent. I think when I say too cheap here, what I mean really is, for a primary measure, you spend money on this measure and it impacts on how much money you can spend at the second stage. And there might be, if it's relatively simple loft insulation, it might be quite cheap, basically. So it might not enable you to do other works as well. And there have been some instances of poor work, and some instances of people just leaving rolls of loft insulation unwrapped in lofts that we have seen. So yes, it's always worth checking that they definitely have put it in. This is all very new and exciting. Air source or ground source heat pumps. Now, these work almost like a fridge in reverse by compressing air and then extracting out the heat. And so the air is compressed with small electrical fans, and then the heat can then be utilised within the property. It's relatively low-grade heat. It can be used for space heating, kept in like hot water tanks. But whilst these have been up till now pretty poorly performing in the field, let's say, their performance is getting better and better. We've had huge amounts of interest in this. high decarbonisation impact when you're measuring against, or potential, let's say, impact when you're measuring against things like gas boilers, relatively expensive. Do you want to talk about this, Liam?
Yeah, I'd say that when it comes to talking about future ways of heating houses, I am firmly on the side of air source heat pump over the theory of hydrogen, because it actually exists. And yeah, it's great for it works really well with solar PV. If you've got it all running into the same hot water cylinder, it's not. I have to say that an air source heat pump, if you're viewing it as saving money on your bills, it doesn't really work that way, because if you're moving from a gas boiler onto something that's electric is 3 times the price of gas. So maybe in the future, as gas becomes increasingly rare, air source heat pumps will become cheaper, but don't look at them as a saving measure on your bills.
So, and I think this is the primary measure that we're both quite excited about and quite worried about. And I suppose the exciting bit is what Liam's just expanded there. Fantastic, lots of opportunities. Our concerns: small supply chain in the UK. Not many people out there doing this at the moment. Basic energy efficiency works are required in advance of fitting a heat pump in. If you just chuck a heat pump, which is giving you relatively low-grade heat, into a poorly performing building, very drafty, it's going to be really inefficient. You're going to lose a lot of that heat. It's going to have to work overtime. It could end up costing more, very much more, very poorly performing. We've run a whole course on this over the summer, and we've got another session coming up at the end of September with Florence Collier, who I believe is on the call today, who's an M&E engineer, and we'll explore it in greater detail. But really, proper heat loss calculations needed. Now, not going into too much detail, there might be installers that do very back of the fag packet envelope, or whatever, calculations. Say, you need a heat pump of this size, there you go. And I'm a bit unsure about things, so I'll increase it in size and make it even bigger. And that is exactly the wrong way to go with heat pumps. They need to be properly sized to the heat loss of every single room in the property. They need to be minimized in size as much as possible, and run high, and run to good efficiency as well. So, and we're concerned that there'll be a lot of interest, and there is a lot of interest. We know there's a small supply chain, and people are going to be pressured to put in the heat pumps without doing that kind of design and specification. So potential, but risks. Solar thermal, which is my colleague Ben is absolutely mad about this stuff. Do you want to talk about it, Liam?
Yeah, I am also a big fan of solar thermal. It's not used anywhere near enough, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But put simply, it gives you hot water. It gives you free hot water in summer without it going through a photovoltaic panel. Water goes into the tubes, goes round, goes into a water cylinder, and it's a very effective way of heating water.
Yeah. They're pretty simple, but they do require regular, knowledgeable maintenance. And we've seen quite a few systems that are they're not working, and a lot of it's because they haven't been maintained, or the people that have them haven't been able to find the people to maintain them. Fantastic.
They're quite complicated to get the flow and return right on,
yes.
To actually make them run efficiently, and a lot of early adopters kind of fitted them themselves based on having like a basic functioning knowledge.
Yes, so some quite well actually. Richard Dallington, one of our members in Saddleworth, his is still going after 20 odd years, but I've also seen some that are not. Okay. Oh, biomass boilers. I'm questioning why biomass boilers are in here, given their low carbon, whether they deserve their low carbon status. There are lots of studies showing that the type of biomass burn can have quite a high impact or carbon impact. There's also increasing concerns about indoor and outdoor pollution, sort of people inside properties being exposed and outside. There's potential for legislation coming in this area for the outside. Can be misspecified as well, overspecified, lots of heat loss. And I question whether these are suitable for domestic and especially urban context. So I don't know whether you want to add anything, Liam.
No, I'd say the only time that you'd ever want to put in a biomass boiler is if you're the kind of person who thinks that the Drax power plant is renewable energy.
That's a whole different webinar, but there you go.
Yeah.
Now, one of the concerns for us is ventilation. And ventilation, well, the more you thermally improve a property, the more you improve air tightness, the more you need to ventilate, because moisture, breathing, cooking, washing builds up in the atmosphere, needs to be ventilated. You know, in an uninsulated property, it just blows away, but insulated, it needs to be ventilated. There is a huge amount of research on COVID, which I'm and others are immersing themselves in at the moment. And this is, and I'm surprised, a government scheme in the time of COVID isn't incentivizing ventilation. Now, not getting too technical, but the contractors that will be doing the work need to do essentially a ventilation assessment as part of the quality standard. So that has to be done, but the measures are not funded. Yeah, and I think our concern is that perhaps the ventilation measures are kind of downplayed. We're huge fans. People, there's a thing here, Air Eco, are the installers here, or the manufacturers of this system. Ventilation, all types of ventilation, but just having a ventilation strategy is a must, really, if you're going to thermally improve. Would you agree, Liam?
Absolutely agree. If you're getting measures done under this, make sure that you keep some money aside and think about ventilation.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be, people talk about mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, and that is great. But it's a big investment, and probably for people that are going further, But there are ways you can fit fans that are relatively cheap, relatively simple, and are proportionate to the works you're spending. So yeah. So you spend money on those primary measures, and it unlocks secondary measures. Now we're tight on time, so I'm not going to go through all these. One thing I would observe is a lot of the things in the secondary measures are things that we would advocate as kind of they're almost primary measures for us. Things like draft proofing, very simple but effective. Double glazing, triple glazing really improves comfort and performance. External energy efficient doors, an integral part of a whole house approach. Heating controls. Be surprised how many boilers don't have them at the moment, and how much impact they can have turning heat on at the appropriate time. Hot water thermostats and tanks and insulation. Without going into this in too much detail, Liam, what would you make a comment on this?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a failing, really, that you only get this measure for upgrading from single glazed,
right?
And not from getting all double to triple. But that's the only extra thing that I'd add to it, I think.
Yeah. I've removed a few of the details here. There are other limitations, like on the door, for example. If talking to bears, which we're really emphasising these measures. They're simple but effective, and they're low risk. When we talk about these primary ones, and we've highlighted different risks as we've gone along, these really don't have those risks. So just to summarise this bit, I would say, so there's a range of primary measures. Some of them are really interesting. Some of them are an integral part of a whole house approach. Fantastic. All of them, I think, come with risks, and risks that need to be mitigated in delivering the grant scheme. And that's, as Liam says, it's a little bit unclear from there. Sometimes the contractors will do design, contractor-led design, and that's often fine, but often on a higher risk, more tricky, where detailing, design work, or M&E specialisms are required. There's a need for a third party to come in and do the work, do that little bit of specification design that improves quality. That's our comment on that, really. Part of assessment is informing that. Finding contractors, I won't go into this in too much detail, and Nika, my colleague, will chip in, but in terms of the contractors that can do the work, it isn't everyone, as I said. You might have worked with a contractor down the road, local firm, a family firm. It might be that you can't work with them on this. It's limited contractors with a specific quality standard called PAS 2030. There's a few names and acronyms around at the moment. I talked about PAS 2035, which is the latest quality process standard. PAS 2030 predates that, so it's a little while ago. And there were good things about it, absolutely, but it does create an administrative burden on the contractors. There's also a requirement to gain trust mark membership. So these things are aimed at creating a quality standard around the works done. But because of the use of PAS 2030, it does limit some of the materials that are available to certain specified and that have certain guarantees basically awarded. And there might be some of the more eco things that don't have those guarantees. And you can find the contractors via the website. And I think that's part of the delay, is trying to get as many contractors as possible onto that website, really. A bit more on the contractors. And yeah, I'll hand over to Anika if you've got any comments, but it will tend towards the larger contractors that aren't based necessarily down the road. The contractors that are involved in the scheme, because the supply chain, let's not beat around the bush, has been degraded over the years because there hasn't been investment in this area. It means that there's a small pool and they're likely to be very busy, and this could lead to delays for householders that have that voucher and want to get the work done. There are potentially quite severe skill shortages as well, and I would highlight in particular solid wall insulation and heat pumps as well as specific kind of measures where there's not a lot of people out there that do this. And obviously, as we've highlighted, quality is a concern, so we want people that will do it really well. The contractors are likely to charge more than market rate. Now, that's supposition on our side, but we're basing that on the fact that there's a small group of contractors and there's going to be a huge amount of demand. So at least to begin with, there will likely to be, you're likely to pay more. You offset some of that through you got the grants, you got free money, but I think it's a cost benefit that needs to be taken into account. The final thing I'd like to say here is that quality standards are not always a guarantee of quality. And in those past schemes, that some of them that went wrong, they were under things like Eco Energy Company Obligation, which did have quality standards associated with them. What I'd say is things like PAS 2030 and PAS 2035 are aiming to learn the lessons of those past schemes that went badly and try and improve standards. But personally, and as Carver Court, we don't think it's enough just to say we've got this piece of paper, it'll be fine. And especially in a scheme like this, where there's a lot of demand, there's a lot of money going around, and there's the potential of people, not always and sometimes the quality standards, you can tick the right box, but have you done what's around that box? I don't know. Nika, did you want to make any comment here on some of the contractors that we work with and some of their perspectives?
Yeah, so we've sort of developed a network of contractors who are mostly quite small scale. They'd work on sort of small jobs, extensions, sole traders, micro businesses or small firms. And unfortunately, the accreditation for this scheme presents quite significant barriers for that scale of contractor, because the accreditation is quite expensive and there's quite a lot of paperwork. So it normally works for businesses that have admin staff available to do that kind of work for them. So this means that it's this isn't necessarily true for all the contractors we work with, and some of them are working through to get accreditation to do some work through this scheme. But others, the barriers are potentially just too big to be able to access work through the scheme. But these are kind of the contractors who are highly skilled, do a lot of really good quality energy efficiency works, have shared values and are really dedicated to this work and the wider values around this work. And those contractors really rely on your business. So I guess our main message is just that whilst there's some money available through this scheme, most people want to go as far as they can with their retrofit projects. So I would consider using this grant as one piece of a wider project, but for that wider project, really utilise the sort of skills experience of sort of the smaller scale contractors that we work with, because they'll do a really good quality job for you, and they also really need your business.
Yeah.
Right now in this kind of quite uncertain time. So,
yeah, I think that really, really makes sense, because those contractors that do have PAS 2030 are likely to be constrained, resource-wise, time-wise. So, using these other contractors, and especially on the wider projects really makes sense. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, not for now. I think that was the main thing.
Cool. And we may well have questions come up in the Q&A. So yeah. Okay, to round things off, well, on the scheme side of things, pros and cons really, or things to consider. Pros: free money, fantastic, brilliant. Who's going to say no? And I suppose it does help the economy, and it's a time when, especially contracting and supply chains need that money as well. So it is good for that. It's the potential there to save money for people, householders, save money and save carbon, and improve the comfort of their homes and do stuff. And I think the discussions we've talked about here and looking at people's priorities, it can form a part of a wider project. It can help subsidise or get people over a barrier, into retrofit, thinking, right, if I've got this scheme and I do that and I can build my other stuff around it. It's also for contractors and for local authorities and all sorts of intermediaries. It's an incentive to train new people, and we really do. We've got a huge challenge. We've got 27 million homes in the UK that need retrofitting. It's a huge challenge. It's a huge opportunity. We need to train people to do it, and it will give people jobs, quality jobs for life, basically. The cons, the things to consider really. Do you have a plan? If you're going to get this money, how does it fit into your plan for your property? Because I think if you just take one measure and throw it at the wall, so to speak, it's not going to be the best use of the money. It might not even be the best thing to do, full stop. Are you taking a holistic approach? Where does this improvement or these improvements fall into your wider ambitions and your plans? Will you be paying over the odds, and does that matter given the free money bit? I think it's important to acknowledge that might be the case, that you're going to pay over the odds. So, how do you feel about that? Do you understand that? And could the project be delayed as a result of being a part of this wider scheme with all these kind of contractors and such? Are there other ways to achieve that project, or, as Anika was saying, achieve parts of that project? So I think in general terms, our view here, we're incredibly enthusiastic about government investing in schemes such as this, investing money, cold hard cash, into low carbon economy. What we say is we'd hope that they take a long-term approach to this and not try and throw money out the door by the 31st of March, that there are consideration taken to building up the supply chain. It's taking longer. And from a householder point of view, I think it's a great opportunity, but it needs to be interrogated. What is that? No such thing as a free lunch. And I think that is the case for a lot of these kind of grants and subsidy schemes, that it's free money, but it's not entirely without strings. It might limit what you want to do. It might limit the type of things you might spend, materials and what have you. So yeah, approach with caution. So help from People Powered Retrofit. So this is, I guess, if people are in the Greater Manchester area or in Cheshire, Liverpool, Sheffield, that sort of area, South Lancs as well. So we're helping people in this kind of area. If people just want the grant and they don't want to do anything else, and that's totally fine, then we probably signpost people on to the Simple website or to the appropriate websites. We'd really love to be able to give people unpaid advice, free advice, which is a job that the Energy Savings Trust used to do, and it was government funded, and that money's gone. And so EST is still around in some form, but they haven't got the advice lines that they used to. We'd love to be able to give free advice, but we don't have the funding, we don't have the capacity to do that. So if you're just interested in something, we'll signpost you. If you're living in the Greater Manchester conurbation or nearby, we can offer these things. We can offer advice and help in developing a brief. We can do those home retrofit planner assessments for people if they're interested. We can offer coordination services and design development. We can do on-site training and quality assurance. We can help with procurement and with toolbox talks for householders, for contractors rather. And we can include the grant eligible measures in this process basically as part of a holistic plan rather than a kind of adjunct to that. And we also do handover and evaluation of that sort of thing. And one thing which I'll round up before we go to the Q&As, is that we have a load of free webinars or pay what you want webinars coming up. Obviously, this is today's webinar, but if you go to the Carbon Co-op website and if you go to events in the top right-hand corner, you'll see we have sessions coming up on home energy systems, on contracts, construction contracts, on heat pumps, as I said earlier, beginner's guide to retrofit. If you just want to know a bit more, we're running a free session next Wednesday. Very welcome to come to that. And we've got a whole other load of specialist training for contractors, supply chain consultants and what have you. So just check out the events link on our website and you can see more of those. Right then, do we have any questions? Who's been looking at the questions?
So we've been answering them as we've gone along.
Yes, yeah.
But also there's the opportunity for anyone to put up their hand as well, I think. Right?
Anika, do you want to maybe highlight some of the questions that have come up? I know people can see them as well. They can go and read them, but do you want to just summarise some of the questions that have come up?
Sure. There's one from Isabel that's, does it make sense to fit an air source heat pump now under the Green Homes Grant Scheme? And then when it's affordable, fit a solar PV to offset the electricity costs of the pump?
Yeah, Liam, do you want to you kind of mentioned that, didn't you, in your when you were talking about that measure?
Yeah. An air source heat pump and solar PV do work really well together, but if your home is cold and drafty, I wouldn't suggest fitting an air source heat pump now because you will get rid of your boiler as part of it, and we are coming up to our famous Lancastrian winters.
I think that is a classic example of fabric first, isn't it, actually, Liam? Because it's treat the fabric first, and I think it doesn't necessarily be a whole house deep retrofit to even consider putting a heat pump in. There are things that can be done, air tightness works can be done, but as much as possible reduce demand from the fabric, then move on to services, then to think about generation, and that's kind of the fabric first hierarchy.
Yeah, well, I actually said in the air source heat pump webinar last week that maybe if you've only got a certain amount of money and want an air source heat pump, you're better improving the fabric than getting the air source heat pump.
Yeah.
And
you can always look on it as a step-by-step staged kind of approach.
It's preparing you for getting an air source heat pump.
Yes.
It's part of the journey.
Yes. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, there's a connected question about ground source heat pumps.
Oh, yes, so we didn't really talk about that, did we?
Yeah, and Catherine Simmons has asked whether they lower bills because that's the advice that they were given at Home Baked. But they've asked, is it about the full retrofit package, which I think they mean sort of a whole house approach.
Is it Home Baked in Anfield?
Yeah, I think so.
Because I think from what I know of that system is that it's a shared ground loop, and it's also it's kind of so it's a number of properties benefiting from the same kind of heating system. So I don't think we could comment on whether it will save money or not, because that's a specific scheme with a specific set of kind of variables that we've not seen. But I'm sure from knowledge that you are working with people in that kind of thing. Do you want to talk in general terms about ground source heat pump, Liam?
Yeah, to be honest, it's not a ground source heat pump isn't something that I've massively worked with, but I know that they are. Your bills are slightly cheaper with the ground source heat pump, but you also need an enormous garden that you're not planning on growing things in, and a lot of money to set it up in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I can see them being quite popular under this scheme. I can see potentially ground source heat and the biomass boilers being more applicable to, let's say, larger properties in the countryside. So, not making any, comments, but I can see that's where they would work. It's an interesting one, Home Baked, because it's Anfield and it's urban, and it's also a shared system, so it'd be really interesting to see it get off the ground, which hopefully it will. Any other questions?
Well, just keeping with the heating theme, and then maybe we'll move on to fabric again. Anita's asked, combi boilers are often recommended, which then negates the need for a hot water tank. However, would you recommend keeping a hot water tank for future solar thermal or as future energy store methods? which I think is a very interesting idea.
I really regret getting rid of my hot water tank, which was about 6 years ago now. Because it gives you just so much more flexibility in terms of how you can use energy. We were talking about solar PV. You can divert it into a hot water tank, solar thermal, hot water tank, heat pump. What do you think, Liam?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, where I live now, we ripped out some copper tanks and then had them replaced with new tanks. Which it was only after the event everyone went, "Oh, we probably could have reused the originals." So yeah, keep your tanks.
I know. I got 100 quid for mine. I was like, "Oh, brilliant, amazing! 100 quid for something I don't want." And you're like, "Oh God, I've got to pay 500 quid for a new one."
Well, what mind, the bottom had dropped out of the scrap metal market when we got rid of ours.
Yeah. Okay, that's a little moan from us. So, any other questions? You all right fielding them, Anika? Because Matt might be able to field them.
I'm waiting for Matt to say something.
Maybe he's staying quiet tonight.
I think he's typing answers to people.
Okay, cool.
There's lots of questions about heating here, but maybe that's appropriate because
of course.
Good use of the grant. Someone's asked whether we'd recommend anyone if they use the scheme for an air source heat pump.
What a specific installer?
Yeah, I think that's what's being asked.
I mean, one thing I would say is MCS. They need to be MCS registered. Micro generation certificate. Oh, I don't know. Sorry, I've been caught out there. But MCS registered, so it's a certain quality standard. But I think what we really advocate is probably using an engineer to do the initial heat loss calculations, so that the specification is appropriate. And sometimes, not always, sometimes installers will favour a certain brand or a certain type of system, and having an engineer involved would help basically specify it properly. What was it? Individual installers, we don't really have names, but what I would say is, if you're interested in this area, come to the session that Florence is running for us at the end of the month, and we'll talk more there. You know, we also give Florence a lot of work, and we think she's a great engineer. So yeah, it's a little push for her.
Another question.
Yeah.
Someone's asked if external wall installation or internal wall installation is applied for. Does it have to be for the whole building?
Liam?
No, you can apply for single elevations and single sections of it. It doesn't have to be a whole house.
Yeah. And without going into too much detail, like pinning you down, if you're insulating a property, like external wall insulation, and no, you might not insulate every wall, but if you're looking to do a property, what sort of bill are we looking at for I know there's different materials as well, but what sort of figures?
I'd say for external wall insulation, let's go for a sort of fairly average 3-bedroom house, you might be looking at about, well, depending on material, you would be looking at sort of between 12 and 18,000.
Yeah. There's a little picture which is on the screen now, which is the avatar for this, and that's sort of a property like that. From memory, I think it was about 10 or 11, and that was wood fibre. Might have been a bit more, like Liam says. So it's in that kind of context that you take $5,000, you know. So it can, I think, could be an enabler, you know, for that kind of thing. But as we've sort of said, is to treat with caution in terms of design and specification. Yeah.
Oh, and the meeting halfway on it. I mean, that would get you a full gable done on a semi-detached.
Yes.
Like, it would comfortably get you into that.
Yeah. In fact, that property, you can't really see, but that property, they had the front done and they had the bay window rebuilt, and then I think a return down the side, and then it was cavity wall. So you were able to mix that and have an effective thing. So yeah. And any more questions?
Yeah, there's one from Brit, and she asked, is the same grant scheme for all householders and landlords? Is it the same grant scheme for all householders and landlords in the end. So social and community housing, as well as individual landlords and households.
Right. So there's owner occupiers, there's private rental, and then the social rental, social housing, isn't there? So this scheme covers private owner occupiers and private rental, and so you have to, if you apply for the scheme, you have to own a home. You don't have to own it and live in it, but you have to own it. And secondarily, that thing around fuel poverty and access to benefits, that doesn't count if you're a landlord. Yeah. So if you're a landlord and someone in your property is in fuel poverty, then you can't claim the 10 grand. You can claim the 5 grand. There's a separate money there for social housing, which we've not gone into today because it's not our area of expertise, really. Do you know any more on it, Liam?
Not on the social housing side of things, no. I'm afraid not.
But yeah, it's £3 billion in all. I thought it was 2 billion, and then Liam corrected me. So this pot is 2 billion. So yeah, it's a lot of money. Okay.
So I'm just looking through. There's a question about whether insulation to flat roofs is included as a primary measure. And I believe it is, actually.
Yeah, so there was 2 primary measures that we didn't go into, which was flat roof and park homes, which again is not something we've got a tremendous amount of experience with. But do you know anything about the flat roof stuff, Liam?
No, just that it is covered in the same way as loft insulation. It's roof insulation is roof insulation as far as the scheme is concerned.
Yeah.
There's lots of people who've asked, we want to get Carbon Corp over our way. We live in York or Coast, or I'm somewhere else. So maybe there could be something said about that, because we've had a
yes. Yeah, so with People Powered Retrofit, we've had loads of interest in replicating the service elsewhere, and that's something we're working really hard on, basically, to replicate it with what we'd describe as like-minded organisations. So we're working with Cumbria Action for Sustainability, a sustainability charity based in Cumbria, for example, and they're starting to deliver some of our services on a kind of social franchise scheme, let's say. And basically, yeah, we're open to working with more groups. I would say is that we're there's a lot of demand at the moment, a lot of interest, which is great, which is fantastic. So we're just working to work with all that. So what I would really advocate is that if you're a householder or you're kind of interested, and there's a community energy group in your area, those are the key people that we kind of work with, sustainability charities and community energy groups. But yeah, we know there's a huge amount of demand, and we're really, really committed to sharing our knowledge and expertise. And a lot of the things that we're designing, we do a lot of IT tools and web-based tools. We put them in an open source license to replicate elsewhere. So yeah, we're really focused on that. But yeah, we're doing as quick as we can.
There's another question here that was on the chat, and I would encourage people to put questions in the question and answer box, because that's where I'm looking mostly. This question is, who can independently do a house retrofit audit? It's like a house assessment. What would be suitable for an old property? Yeah,
I mean, within past 2035, this process standard we talked about, and if I go back through the slides, when we looked at the kind of the different stages of retrofit here, so there's a competency called retrofit assessor there. Now, and what I would say is, like, it's a spectrum that starts with an EPC assessor, or what was Green Deal assessors, which are relatively simple, cheap. You might pay £35 for an EPC assessment, and you get what you pay for, basically. So you get relatively simple information, and then you can go up, basically. So there are surveyors and assessors. It is, like all this, it's a limited supply chain out there, and there's a limited number of people. We're really inundated by people wanting in assessments, and we've done hundreds to date, and we've got a long waiting list that we're endeavouring to get through. We're actually recruiting new assessors all the time, so we look towards people from a contractor background, from a surveyor background, consultancy background, architects as well. So some architects can do this as well. The Association of Environmentally Conscious Building, which we previously kind of referenced, they're a good source of kind of finding people in your local area. Green Register as well is another organisation that could help in this area. So yeah, don't know, Liam, do you want to say anything on this? Are you there?
Oh, hello. No, I think you pretty much covered everything, and I was slightly sidetracked looking at the questions in chat. So.
Just to say, we'll run for another 10 minutes, so it's about 7:25. So if anyone got any questions, yeah, get them in now. Anything else, Anika?
Yeah, there's an interesting one here. So from Debbie, regarding works required to enable installation, which are excluded? For example, trimming doors for solid floor installation.
Leah?
I guess it's yeah.
So can you say that again? I
guess the question is if you are getting some installation works, what parts of the works will be excluded? For example, we have to do lots of finishing work yourself. If the floor's raised through floor installation, will you have to get another carpenter in? And I guess it depends on what you've agreed with the contractor as you agree the works. And those are sort of good questions to sort of check with them. But it's worth checking that out. We won't have the answer to that, I think. But Liam, you might have experience of this through some of the work.
Well, I mean, I would suggest that if you're doing insulation work, then the work that needs to be done to make that a finished job should be covered by the grant scheme. I've not seen anything one way or the other that would confirm it. But if you're having floor insulation and it means that your door needs altering, then well, that's part of the work. I suppose it comes down to if the builder has quoted for that work and itemised it and said trimming doors, for example. That's where it would matter.
It is tricky in retrofit, and I think so. That's a very simple kind of instance, yeah. And you can imagine that being packaged into the works. The price of the works is that. But what if you pull up a floorboard and you've got rotten joists, and it's like, right, okay, we're going to have to replace these joists, and that's going to cost many thousands of pounds. That's we'd have to look to see whether there are terms and conditions for this scheme that have not been released yet. So it may be well that they're in there, may well that they're in past 2030, but obviously that won't tell you whether they're covered in costs. But yeah, I think that's another thing for doing as much investigation as possible in advance to minimise surprises later on. Yeah.
I mean, it must be said that's not exclusive to the grant, though. If you want to insulate your floor, lift up your floorboards, and then find the joists are rotten, that's the universal thing, whether you get in the grant or not. It wouldn't surprise me if the grant didn't cover sort of repair work.
I think it does cover repair work, and I think it's important to consider that and not install insulation over sort of a room that's got damp issues, for example.
Yeah,
that maintenance is really important to think about first.
Cool.
There are a couple of questions about loft conversions and room in.
Oh yes, which is room in roof is covered. Yeah, go on.
So one of the questions is just any advice on room on roof, and the other ones I've just put them together because they're similar. Someone's interested in remodeling their house to do a loft conversion. Actually, I don't quite understand that with insulation to the rest of the house be included, but I guess it's kind of room in roof installation is covered by the scheme. Do we have any advice on that? It is the question.
Yeah, so do you want to tackle that first bit about the room in the roof advice, Liam?
Yeah, the room in roof thing, I need to qualify that by if you want to have a loft conversion done, that's not what the grant covers. It won't cover your insulation for converting your loft at the same time. If you've got a converted loft, you can have that insulated under the scheme, but you can't go from a standard loft with like 2 suitcases in it to a room under this scheme, it won't cover you for that.
Any bits of advice for room in roof insulation?
It depends on how the room and roof has been constructed. If it was done not to building regs, then the chances are that you've got 4-inch rafters, and there will be minimal or non-existent insulation in it. So you'd have to think about underdrawing the rafters. It's a big question, the room and roof. It depends on the construction of the original. And also if it was ever done to regs in the first place, which is quite common that they weren't.
So just to talk to that second question about using this as an opportunity to do other stuff, I think that is quite common. We find that, especially extensions, people are doing an extension and they're doing the extension to, high new standards, fantastic. And can they then use that labour force or that workforce or that disruption as a way to insulate other bits of the property? And yeah, we'd certainly say that can often be a thing. I think, as Anika hinted at or mentioned overtly, is kind of like how that works in the context of this scheme might be quite complicated. Whether you get a big construction firm that've got enough capacity to do the extension and do work under the scheme and are not really busy, not sure. It's a bit of an unknown. Any more questions? We should probably do 2 or 3 and then finish it off.
Also, just to say that we have a lot of questions. There's about open questions, so we won't just to hope no one's too disappointed if we don't get to your question. There are just lots and lots here.
I've said in the past, we'll answer them. We'll answer them on email or on, but that's proved actually quite difficult to do because we've had so many. But what I would say is, we've got more sessions coming up, and have a look at the training stuff as well. So 2 or 3. We could go to past, couldn't we?
There's one here that I think is interesting. Basically, Helen said that she's got a late 1920s property with a combination of a solid floor and a suspended timber floor. And she's called a couple of a GHG sort of certified contractors, and they're only keen on the suspended floor work. So would it be best to avoid, I think what she's asking is what's a good thing to do? Because I think some of the contractors can only want to do the work that they think is easier to do and avoid the sort of trickier work. And that may or may not be okay for you. So it's worth being wary of that kind of dynamic playing out. Obviously, there are risks involved in suspended timber floor insulation work. Liam will have more to say about that. But I didn't quite understand the part of the question that said, would it be best to avoid this area of the house for Green Homes Grant and focus?
I guess maybe it's like, just because it's complicated, forget it and focus on something else.
So maybe don't ask contractors to do complicated, risky, big parts of work, which is probably sensible.
Go on.
I was going to say, because if there's 2 billion going and there's not many contractors who are going to be accredited under the scheme, I think that any builders who are doing it are going to be racing from job to job. I think if you've got a complicated job, then it opens up to potential risk by the work not being done very well. If there are measures just a single point measure which minimises complication, I think you've got a much better chance of getting a better job done under the scheme that way.
And it's important to say with this is to not, if someone says, I can't do that job, don't believe that job can't then be done. Yeah. It just means that they don't want to do that job because it might not be so profitable for them to do it because it's slightly tricky.
A larger contractor will always be less interested.
It might not be their competency as well. They might specialise in different things, and we haven't talked about getting the right contractor, but I think part of it is like the right contractor for the right job. So. But I think I totally agree as well. There will be an amount of cherry picking, absolutely, yeah.
But don't let that leave you with the thought that work can't be done, because that has happened in the past, and that's not necessarily true.
Cool.
got a few minutes left. If any of the other co-hosts see an interesting question, it's quite exhausting this.
Sorry, Anika.
No, actually, there's something about heat pumps again. So someone said, I've read that you could get a grant for the heat pump, and that grant would be taken off the RHI. So that's renewable heat incentive. Is this correct? Do we know the answer to this?
Go on, Liam.
Well, we might have different understandings, but my reading of it was that if you get an air source heat pump fitted under the scheme, you are still eligible for the same RHI that you would have got without the scheme. Yeah,
that's my understanding as well. And there is clarification on that website as well. So, I mean, it's fantastic opportunity for heat pumps. I mean, that's what we're emphasising really. Done well, it's a great opportunity. I think actually, out of all the measures, when we've discussed it internally as a team, we think the one that it fits, that this scheme works best for, is the heat pump. But it's just with that proviso around like doing it right, basically.
Oh, Florence has just clarified with yes, but the amount is taken off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So you can claim RHI, but the amount is taken off. Apologies for that, but it is clarified on the website.
Some people have said I'm confused about how to get contractors in my area, and those areas being not in Greater Manchester. Again, I think sort of checking the Simple Energy Advice website, that will be where lots of the contractors are listed when you go through the website and look at what measure you need. But again, just to be discerning as you engage with those contractors is probably the advice.
Well, there's sort of two parts to that, isn't there? Where can I get contractors for this scheme? They're all on the website. If they're not on the website, you can't use them. And I think hopefully there won't be, but there may be fraud things. So if they're not on that website, they're not applicable. Don't use them. But where can I get contractors to do work who aren't on the scheme? You know, we're running a beginner's guide to retrofit next week, which we give some, good practice on finding contractors. Relatively simple, and we do other things, but there are some good practice things you can do to find contractors in your area. But yeah.
Yeah, well, it's 25 past now, so maybe that's the end of questions and answers.
Fantastic. Is there anything, Liam or Anika, you want to add before we round up?
I guess I would say just keep in perspective the grant scheme. It's it's a bit of money, but it's not necessarily lots in the grand scheme of doing lots of work on your home. And so, make sure that you have a good whole house plan, and you get to use it if it makes sense for you. But if it doesn't quite make sense, don't sort of push it. Maybe.
Yeah, Liam.
Yeah, I'm going to steal what Peter Bates has put in the chat and say that don't rush into a complex retrofit just to get the grant.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice. That's brilliant advice. And as we would advise the government, this is a long-term endeavour, lots of work to do, let's do it properly. Same with householders. The property itself is a big thing to tackle, do it properly. Okay, we're going to stop the recording there, but